into it. Hey, good morning. This is the second to last presentation of the conference, and it says that we have a panel discussion, and that's what we intend to do. But first, Maarten Hajer here is going to present for about 20-25 minutes on work is recently published in an excellent book that I guess you will talk about, but I can also show it. Captured Futures, that he co-authored with Gerald Ullman. And this was published, I think, in May, was it? 2025, yeah. So it's a very recent book, and it's already made a splash, I think, and it's worth reading if you haven't done that yet. But we'll get to that in a minute. So the first thing is that Maarten is going to present for 20-25 minutes, and then I will do a shorter presentation, and then we should have at least 20 minutes for a plenary discussion afterwards. So, it is my honor to introduce Maarten Hajer, who is a distinguished professor in urban futures and futuring and director of the Urban Future Studio at the University of Utrecht. Maarten?
Thank you. So, nice to speak, and I'll try to relate my work to what we discussed before. As Stefan already said, this is a joint work with Jeroen Omen, who's also at the Urban Future Studio. And it took a little longer than we expected to write this book, but actually I think I'm really glad that we took so long, because we ended up with an entirely different book. And the book starts with stipulating something that is very close, I suppose, to our discussions here. The argument that environmental politics as we know it cannot deliver. And actually, in order to save my time for ways out, I will be really brief on why it is not delivering the sort of environmental politics that is sort of epitomized by this picture, which is endlessly repeated in presentations. Countries, that's the ontology, promise too little, they don't keep their promises. It's definitely not going to be a just transition like we discussed the previous days, because again, we have to dig out stuff from the crust of the earth that is not based on empty land, that people actually living there. And finally, and that's an important add-on, we are trying to mop the floor with the tap running, in the sense that we are not addressing the culturally induced demands for stuff. So I'm not going to go into it deeply, but what I will do is to share how we came to this idea of a captured politics. And capture, it's coming back at that term of state capture. You saw it in South Africa, the book on state capture, but also in other states you hear discourse of capture. And the capture in the classical political science sense is the capture of parliamentary politics by lobbyists. And that's definitely very much the case, right? I mean, just think of the backtracking that's occurring in the European Commission, induced by all sort of lobbies from the car industry, and we are very familiar with that. But far more important than that is what we see is the capture in certain discourses and dramaturgy, certain ways of doing politics. And even more important and fundamental is that there's also a capture of the imagination. So people cannot see for themselves, think, conceive a future that is different, markedly different from ours. So in this book we use the language of discourse and dramaturgy, and really I've come to embed my work on discourse in that work on dramaturgy, so that to conceive of politics as theatrical, as always enactments, staged enactments, and in a sequential logic. And that, I think that really helps also to get your finger behind why our current politics is not working. And that there are people who are really playing their role in chairing a COP, being brought to tears by countries that at the final end demand changes like we always see. And they're captured by that dramaturgy, how they have to do their politics. And that, I think, is that dramaturgical regime, as we call it, is something that helps explain why in a particular routinized way of working you cannot get the solutions that we need, that sort of the earth requires. And that is also because the language within which we do this is that of ecological modernization. And ecological modernization is something that I analyzed already in my dissertation way back in '95, and I was sort of reluctant to put that card on the table again. But I think by and large this is how we do environmental politics. So believing that there is positive sum game, I mean the electric vehicle, that policy making is the ultimate way of doing it, that the natural sciences define the problem primarily through modeling, that issues need to be resolved through market instruments and technological innovation, that the Global South is to be appeased through financial compensation of nation states, and that there is a very narrow understanding also of the history of environment, the present of the environment, and the future of the environment. Now, if we don't break out of this logic of ecological modernization, we say it's completely clear we end up in geoengineering. Geoengineering is a technological innovation. It is organized by the global north, and it is that the sort of technology of last resort that fits that discursive frame. But there are many reasons why we shouldn't want to go there, if only because we don't know the consequences when we would use the world as a laboratory in a big sense. So there's reason to try and break out of that capture. And I think that starts with, well, in this group, it's a familiar narrative, of course, re-narrating what the environmental situation is about. And that requires us also to address a narrative that says something about industrial modernity as a phase, as a historical phase that we might move away from. We need to start to narrate the present as the past. And it also allows us to problematize the present more, and perhaps also speculate much more effectively about possible futures. So this cartoon, of course, says that already way back, the idea that there are all these other things that we keep on not saying because there is this predominance of the natural sciences. The idea that everything has to be argued in CO2 or NOx, depending on the issue, but we do not actually talk about the real concerns of real people. So if farmers are really completely upset about what we're trying to do in restructuring agriculture, it is because of nitrogen. If we take away the possibility for the French to use the car to get their groceries and the Yellow Vest protest come, it is because we say, well, it is a CO2 tax, CO2 is a problem. Right? So you foreground the language that is not familiar, that doesn't resonate to normal people, and we have much better ways of narrating our stories. The third strategy is defamiliarization. As the Russian formalists have done that in the early 20th century in a magnificent way. So to absurdize the present. So I have many examples of that, I can't show them for reasons of time. Or to familiarize with utopia, to render alternative futures imaginable and likable. And then finally, obviously, start to mop with the tap closed, so address the push under our cultural aspirations. So the book argues in that third element of the book, the third part, that we need to go for a cultural approach to environmental politics, which is a much broader understanding of what environmental politics is about than, being busy with policy making. Now, let me run you through a couple of visible alternatives of politics already, and we use that here, the language of dramaturgy. Now, the first dramaturgy that you already see is that of backlash, and that's a nasty one. It's not a helpful one at all. And so this is Oxford in 23 in February, people protesting against the 15-minute city. I mean, the 15-minute city is the most mundane utopia of planners, that things are within reach, 15 minutes on a daily basis, but it was twisted to be, security state, or the state wanting people to live in districts, not leave them, etc. Complete nonsense, but it worked very well. There were thousands of people flocking through the high street. But in research that we do, you also see how the way in which we organize public participation leads to that backlash. It is not an autonomous happening. It is actually something that is induced by policy-making practices. If you think of these 380 kV high voltage lines and the way in which people are just pushed through, agreeing with it, rather than actually thinking about regional development strategies of which these high voltage lines are a part, you actually understand why they get angry, and actually you also understand why the civil servants doing that just give up their jobs. That's what we find. So the citizens say, well, this democracy is not my democracy, the state is dubious, it's not legit, and the people actually doing that on the ground, the civil servants say, well, this is not my job, I'm quitting. Massively. Really good people leaving their jobs. Now the second one is slightly more positive, and that's also the picture on the front of the book. Nice to show it in Germany, obviously, because it is a German picture. I thought that was extremely clever, actually, because this is all scripted. So to have all these people walking in front of Mad Max machines in their white dresses, the innocence of the white dresses versus the big machines of the coal industry, and the light of a late afternoon, precisely the right light for the best photography and so forth. So this idea of playing with the image, playing with Instagram and so forth I think, is something that they definitely learned very well. It didn't lead to much in this particular case, but a slightly more hopeful case of moral protest was a tiny little protest that we had in the Netherlands. And although, again, you would say, well, what is it all about? I thought it was interesting because the Extinction Rebellion started to block a motorway, and people thought, that's preposterous, it won't work. People don't like to be disrupted in the Netherlands, like in many other countries. But what actually happened was that by a phase of scripting and counter-scripting, it led to a sort of festivalization of protest. And everybody in the country started to talk about fossil subsidies. And I thought that was very interesting, because fossil subsidies is one of those technocratic OECD inventions. You subsidize something that you don't want, that's not rational in the OECD terminology. But in Dutch politics, nobody talked about it. But through these protests, people started to talk about it and said, well, that's strange, we should stop. So there was a big support actually for it. And actually, some of us then also used the theatrical means. Frank is also visible in this picture. I'm not sure that you're known as a radical, but here you are blocking a motorway together with other Dutch professors. We brought the theatrical of the gown to that situation, because you know that if you do that are the irresistible pictures in our sort of modern mediatized age. And when people then started to bring all these toys from the swimming pool, to counterbalance the weight of the water cannons that were firing at them, then you see how that play of scripting and counter-scripting can work, and of course, very important, had an effect on how people perceive these protests. Now the third is the dramaturgy of litigation, and that's of course a hopeful thing. Thousands of cases where human rights treaties are used to stop all sort of fossil-based policy regimes with market success. And I think actually I was a bit surprised in the previous days that the name Amitav Ghosh wasn't mentioned at all. Whereas I think that the Nutmeg Curse, for me at least, is the best book I read in the last 10 years. And Amitav in that book says something about litigation that I think brings the subtlety to the point. He says, what is astonishing about the New Zealand River, about getting rights, is that the judges who granted them would probably, in their personal capacities, find the notion of a sacred mountain no less preposterous than the thought that the river might be their ancestor. And that is the cultural shift, you see? So that somebody who's completely bourgeois judge starts to think, well, perhaps there is something to that argument that nature should get rights. So that is the register which we don't tap into with all the policy-oriented politics that is so dominant in ecological modernization. And I think that's absolutely crucial for litigation. Now, another one that's hopeful, but in a sort of nasty sense, is what's happening with dramaturgy of financial risk and opportunity. And then I don't mean carbon credit schemes. They are a scam that's financialized climate politics, a total nightmare and a disgrace. But what financial risk and opportunity is the reinsurance firms getting worried about climate effects no longer being insurable and then going bust. Now, if you go back, and we do it in the book, if you go back to the start of the insurance in the Phoenician shipping, I used to work in that domain in the 90s, risk and insurance. And capitalism without insurance can't exist, right? So if the insurance system falls away from capitalism, it's in deep, deep trouble. And so you get two actors now, the regulators, the national banks, European Bank also, and the reinsurance firms getting extremely nervous. In the Netherlands, even banks are extremely nervous about the mortgage portfolios, which is in lower-lying lands, and they are afraid that because of climate shifts and sea level rise, they will actually go under if people are not taking their losses in time so that their mortgage portfolios remain profitable. So the fifth is obviously the dramaturgy of new democratic practice. And again, I'm not one of those that says that citizen juries and so forth are the solution, as some people seem to say. But what I do say, and see time and time again in France, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and elsewhere, that if you get a representative selection of citizens in a citizen jury context, citizens are willing to do much more radical things than the parliament. And that means that, the logic of a captured parliamentary politics holds. So a different representative organization than a citizen jury, time and time again, leads to more radical solutions being acceptable and being proposed. And that is food for thought, right? So it's an alternative dramaturgy that is worth pushing. Now the sixth is about experimentation and new aspirations. Because of reasons of time, I have to skip that one. And I also have to skip the dramaturgy of violence, which I think is important to keep in the set. I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson speculates on an IPCC with a dark branch, right? Andreas Malm is also sort of speculating that if climate change is violence, we might respond with violence. Anyway, so I'll leave that and devote the rest of my time to what we are doing, namely to create a new dramaturgy of futuring. And I have to tell you a bit about what that is. So that is the idea that we can bring to life aspirational futures and allow people to experience them. So it's not about deliberative democracy. I've written enough about deliberative democracy to say, well, I know also what the limitations are, the exclusionary effects of reasoned deliberation and who has access to that, etc. So we need to think about atmospheres of effect. And Ben Anderson speaks about that and other people as well. Now, I experimented with that in an exhibition I did in 2018 in Leeuwarden, which was then the cultural capital of Europe. And I give you a few images of that exhibition. So we started with a protest march, but that protest march was not against something, it was in favor of all sorts of things. So we flipped the dramaturgy of protest and we flipped it to get a different sort of atmosphere in the city. And so appetite for the future is what that guy, who's actually a director general, he was supposed to open the exhibition, and he found himself very uncomfortable actually in the midst of this protest march. But he thought, I better play along, because otherwise I will be, of course, dead in terms of my reputation. And so here he is. He picked up on appetite for the future as the most neutral one that he could carry around. or this one is to mourn and to say goodbye to all the fossil-based equipments. So to say goodbye to this is the electric, the fossil-based lawn blower. Very useful, but in the past, right? So we said goodbye and thanked the Harley Davidson for its fantastic drives, etc. But it was, alas, it was over. And then in the big room of that exhibition, you could see through different glasses, and you could see different futures. So depending on the color that you had in front of your eyes, you saw a different future. So to immediately say there is no future, there is choice, there are different possibilities. And one of the things that we found is that if you go beyond policy language, go beyond biodiversity, all the terrible words we have invented, and go back to animals and show them, reveal them, people resonate much deeper and much more profound, and much more understanding that things go wrong. Or here people had a labyrinth where they had to make choices. So it was not the state making the choices, they had to make the choices. Or when they walked into into the basement, they found a whole remade Waddenzee, which is the UNESCO tidal sea in the north of the Netherlands, including the smell and the sounds. And people actually, to my surprise, often fell. So they stumbled, they were so overwhelmed by being in that natural environment. And again, I say, well, that's an atmosphere of effect, right? Can we play with emotions? Are we allowed to play with emotions if something as big as the ecological catastrophe is on the table? So we analyzed that, and we said, so there is a possibility for a different environmental politics where the future is a collective object of care, where experiencing future is a space of possibility. You keep people in that space also to discuss it, and to also allow for the emotive power of nature. That is in an article in Environmental Policy and Planning. Now finally, what I'm doing now, I'm going to take a next step, and we have a theory which is called the Futures Prism, and the Futures Prism is, I know, is here. So many in this domain of the future start in the present, at the future scope, that's called. But actually that's wrong. So you have to realize that if you want to go to different futures, you have to step way further back. So there is a tendency to stick to the middle, to have a hegemonic past, how we did things, the narrative that's constantly reiterated, and you end up in captured futures. But if you want to be able to see that what is rendered preposterous, unthinkable, inconceivable, you need to go for these erased paths or the contested paths. So some of the discussions I thought we had the last days were really effective in precisely that. And then futuring becomes the opposite of this. This was the Rand Corporation inventing it for geopolitical reasons and for, of course, for the big corporations to make the future intelligible, as they said. This is our alternative. So here you see a group of people working in the future window, as we call it, and they have to actually create a relationship for themselves in duos between the past and the future. And the thing is, you don't touch the present. So they have to discuss something about, if it is about living or dwelling, some recollection of where you lived that you really appreciated in the past. And then they discuss that, and they go and make this line towards the future, and they have to do it in the normal or in the preposterous, right? So you can span it wider or not. And then they have to have an idealized future of longing. And then once they have discussed that, so you see that over here, once they have discussed that, they label it, they share it also in the group, then they have to say, okay, now what? What do you do different in the present? And it's very simple, but it works very, very well to get people to rethink their possibility. And so I think also to do this in a context of ecological modernization, you have to, for instance, step at least 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years further back to get to a meaningful environmental politics and engagement to break out of ecological modernization. So that also opens up the fact that in the 1970s, of course, there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of struggle. Here, Frankfurt, remember the airport? I do. Kalkar, the nuclear plants and so forth. So, and that, of course, was all funneled into this policy-oriented ecological modernization. And what I actually like is that you then also recapture some of the strategies that are really cultural. And so this is one of my favorites. This is a waste dump where Philips and DuPont had hidden chemical waste in a meadow just north of Amsterdam. It's incredible, but it's true. And when that came out, then of course it was a big outcry. But this group said, and they were called the Deskundelogisch Laboratorium or Expertological Lab. They organized an opera on top of that waste dump, had to pit the precious, the opera, against the vulgar, the industrial modernization. And that sort of play of symbols, I think, actually holds a very alternative politics, also because there is a sense of humor. Right? It is not only about, morality, it's also about playful, about interesting, about something that you want to connect to, like this picture in New York in Earth Day 1970. So an experiential futures prism then goes to this sort of work. This is what I did with, actually with Shell, with TenneT, and with a couple of big harbors, and we presented a visualization of the North Sea as a big time renewable space. And because we allowed that to be played out, it was a massive floor, like as big as this room. They could stand around it, and afterwards they upscaled their efforts, the countries bordering the North Sea, they upscaled their efforts to actually go for renewables, and the Dutch minister said to the news, "We can do it, we stood around it." I mean, well, there's no evidence that you can do it, but he's definitely stood around it. So, I mean, in terms of experiential futuring, it's a little element of where you see that you can play with theater and also do it in a different way than always write these reports. It was a recent model study, right? It was never make nonsense. I mean, there was a model study underneath it supporting the narrative. Now, this is what I'm doing currently with the same artist, and we're trying to do something to break out of the Dutch idea that with dikes and these incredibly expensive dams that we have in Zeeland and so forth, we can hold the water back. And water experts realize it's not true, right? But it is, people have invested so much into that narrative. How can you go to a different approach to the future of the Dutch Delta, which is really problematic? And we think we can do that probably by allowing people to walk through a space and to, depending on where you stand, these screens will change. So we will actually have a 3D futuring possibility, where if you would stand here and you completely an outline, you can see a future that you can't see if you're in the mainstream, right? So, and then people will of course say, well, why are people standing here? Okay, yeah, I see a different future. And then, of course, that play that I just had with that little the little ropes and a small group, we can hope to play out in a national exhibition that I want to organize in the autumn of 2027. So that is what I wanted to show. So the point of what I'm trying to do, being a political scientist, is to realize, that all the investments I made in policy making, including in the UN and everything, might not actually deliver, and therefore I need to reinvent also my practice, and that's why that futuring became central. And it is about reinventing the imagination, and the constant idea is that if people can imagine an alternative future, they start to, sometimes if they like it, make it political, right? So to capture the imagination is massively political. I mean, that's Stephen Luke's, right? I mean, his book on power in 1974. The third dimension of power is that of ideology and so forth. So the domain where you capture the minds of people. And I think we should tap into that much more by inventing how a world that is benign to the planet might also be a really pleasant place. But we need to then not only think about how these images are produced, how they become powerful, how they can cancel, but also to think about the dramaturgies that make people interested in. And then for me, an exhibition like I'm organizing is a dramaturgy of change. It is like a citizen panel. It is an attempt to organize a different societal discourse. And then your role as a university professor becomes one of a curator, right? You are engaging with the stakeholders, with the artists, with the policymakers that have to pay the bill in the end anyway for the exhibition. So I have to persuade them that's in their interest. And hopefully, and studying what we are doing, we can also contribute to the to academic knowledge. Thanks for your attention. If people want to fly off the book, I have some as well.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just skip straight to my presentation once it's on the screen. I'll just switch it.
Keep track. Can you tell us?
Okay, so yeah, in the interest of time, I'll just go ahead with mine. So my presentation is on this concept of biospheric politics that I've been working on as a planetary fellow here at the panel Planetary Thinking. And it's called Biospheric Politics, the Ascent of Planetarism, and what it means for the future. So, what I've been doing as a political scientist, as a political theorist, I did my PhD, is to study ideologies. And ideologies such as neoliberalism and nationalism, for instance, they tend to have a core, and that core is really essential. That's where you find the reason for existence of this ideology. So at the core of nationalism, you think of the national interest. How can you promote the national interest in a zero-sum game with other nations, for instance? At the core of neoliberalism, you find this elitist ideology, or that there is a class of entrepreneurs that can and should be able to spend their wealth as they see fit, because this would be in the best interest of society. And believe it or not, this was a progressive ideology, because when it was developed against aristocracy, where you inherit wealth, and that was against that. But the problem we have today is that with environmentalism and ecologism emerging in the late 60s and early 70s, this is actually the start of a new paradigm of planetary politics that has a completely different core. So what we're experiencing now with this capture politics that Maarten has been talking about is ecologism as an anomaly within the paradigms of nationalism and the paradigms of neoliberalism and / capitalism. So they're trying to accommodate ecologism, but without touching their cores. And what I'm doing with the biospheric politics is to say, we should care about the cores of the other previous ideologies. We should be thinking about the worldview that is now emerging with the planetary scene. And what is the core of that worldview? What is the essence of it? The one thing that is super important. And in planetary politics, it's not that the Earth is a planet. I mean, Mars is a planet, Venus is a planet. The key with planetary politics on the planet Earth is that the Earth is a biospheric planet. That this is a planet with life on it. And life is the core of the planetary in the Earth context. So life has sustained itself continuously on the planet for 3.8 billion years, give or take. Animals have existed for 635 million years. Dinosaurs lived 245 to 66 million years ago, and the genus Homo emerged 2.5 million years ago, and Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago. So in the context of the story of life on the planet, we are, newcomers, not just a little bit newcomers, but like newcomers deluxe. So humans can, in theory, exist for another 1 to 10 million years. This is according to Tim Lenton. And in those 1 to 10 million years, if that's going to transpire, we really have to change how we're conducting politics. And the biosphere itself can continue to exist for another 100 million to 1 billion years. So this is, ballpark figures, obviously. But the thing is that we are a temporary instance in the biosphere, and our task on this planet is above all to make sure the biosphere doesn't, end with us, to put it that way. So this means that we are the temporary custodians, you could say, of these other biocivilizations that actually precede us with, billions and millions of years. So just an example, we have fungi that started appearing 2.4 billion years ago as one of these biocivilizations that we are essentially in a position to destroy if we are doing things if we continue business as usual. But everything that we know and care about in nature is essentially, millions of years older than we are. So, for instance, whales appeared 124 million years ago, and they can, if we behave correctly, they can have another 124 million years ahead of them. So we have to think of ourselves as placed in the middle of this much more, deep time spectrum. And the big thing that we have to do to make sure that we don't, destroy this progression of life on the planet is to learn to become an anthroposphere that is compatible with the continuation of life on the planet. So the anthroposphere, as you can see on this picture in yellow and orange, is currently diminishing the biosphere to the point that its extreme degradation is actually possible. So you have this hothouse Earth scenario where the planet could become like Venus, just like a massive sort of greenhouse with boiling temperatures, and there wouldn't be any life on the planet anymore. Or you could have the nuclear winter scenario that would appear if we have a thermonuclear exchange, as it's called, where we have the same kind of effect as the asteroid that hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs, where you basically just get clouds covering the planet to the extent that there won't be sunlight enough to keep the plants alive and so forth. And the solution is to devise a socioeconomic and political system that works to arrest and reverse this development. So, I know, sorry, I need someone to show the slides properly. Fabrizio, but as Maarten was pointing out earlier, this the fact that we are scientifically burning, the scientific fact that we are burning the candle of the biosphere from both ends is something that we were made aware of, at least in terms of the scientific elites and the political elites in the early 1970s.
Okay, this will take some time. We have to continue.
Okay, I guess we can just continue with the slides not showing properly.
I will be back. I'll put it back.
Yeah. So the point is that we had an early phase of realization what the meaning of this planetary paradigm actually is. What's the consequences of that we live on a planet with life that we are about to destroy. And this is that we have to, diminish, that we have to diminish the effects of the anthroposphere on the biosphere. And already very early in this emergence of this planetary thinking paradigm, we get to the point that we need to establish a planetary order to coordinate action, because this is something that's above nation states. We need a global coordinated action to handle the consequences of this industrial civilization we have. And the other economic consequence is that we have to change to, for instance, a steady state economy, where the effects of the economic intercourse and so forth doesn't negatively affect the biosphere. And these two obvious sort of next steps go completely against nationalism and the nation-centrism, because a planetary order would obviously have to have a supranational sort of coordination. And it goes completely against neoliberalism and capitalism, because a steady-state economy isn't based on growth. It's based on staying, actually on degrowth in the first phase, and then on staying in a steady state afterwards. But this first wave of planetary politics that emerged between 1970 and the 1974-5 is actually something that belongs to what Maarten was talking about as the sort of ignored or forgotten pasts. It's one of these visions that I wasn't taught about this when I was studying political science, at least not in any sort of sustained manner. And I had to dig this up after I had completed my PhD to see what is the interesting ecological thinking that happened in the first phase when people were first confronted with the problems of planetary peril and biospheric peril and so forth. And there's this consensus essentially that we need to coordinate at the global level. Nation states are a thing of the past, and the world economy needs to be essentially constrained. But what happens is, instead of getting to the planet politics that was foreseen in this Guardian article from 1989, where we get a new ideology of greenism or planetism, we actually end up with these captured futures. So we have been in a period of nationalist neoliberal reaction, at least from the 1980s to the present. And it might continue if we don't get new narratives and new ways of thinking about how to deal with this. So in my theory about the ascent of planetarism, which is my term for a planet-centric worldview, as opposed to a nation-centric worldview, is that this is very slowly but steadily manifesting as part of the human culture. So you can see that the planet is basically taken as a given now, as the collective home of humanity, And this is Bruno Latour, essentially just working on the further theoretization of this. And youth elites were really talking about that we need to focus on the planet before profit and so forth. And it's reached a stage where I would say that we now have something called banal planetarism. It's a term that used to be used for banal nationalism, because it's sort of like we reflexively think of ourselves as part of the planet and so forth, and that we live on a planet. But the meaning of planet-centrism that emerged around 1970 is that the defining feature of planet Earth is its habitability for life. The Gaia theory and later Earth system science identifies the biosphere as the key factor for maintaining Earth's habitability. Humanity is part of the biosphere and depends on it for its existence. Planet-centrism in practice therefore means a biospheric politics, and planetarism is a system of meaning diametrically opposed to nationalism, which is nation-centrism, and neoliberalism, which is another word for capitalism. And this is because the long-term planetary biospheric interest now logically takes priority over the short-term national interest or profit motive. So, if we want to ground a new planetary politics, or a planetary politics 2.0, the primary political community of humanity is the multi-species biospheric community, where we are multi-generational biospheric life itself in its specific Gaian manifestation here on planet Earth. And us Earthlings belong to the planetary community and not nations. That is the sort of core, these are core attributes of planetarism. And the perpetuation of the biosphere is the community's primary objective, which is tightly bound up with its present flourishing. So the better the biosphere can flourish, the more likely it is to advance into newer stages later on. And this relegates economic prerogatives and technological possibilities to secondary importance. So this is against neoliberalism. And the new priority is the biospheric interest, ecologically understood. So this means that we get a new floor for politics, a new grounding, or a new foundation, where nationalism, neoliberalism, and present conservatism is rejected. Doesn't fit into that framework. But green ideologies, social liberalism, democratic ways of conducting politics, so you get legitimacy, that is important. Democratic socialism, where you can prioritize planetary and human flourishing ahead of the interests of elites, is also important. So that could be incorporated into this. And one way that could be promoted is using the sort of methods that Soran Mamdani have used recently, but with a different kind of language. So Earthlings for biospheric politics could be one of the slogans for this new politics. And yeah, that rounds off my presentation. And that gives us exactly 8 minutes to have the discussion.